All right, so I guess I get started. Start off just a bit about myself. So can everyone hear me? Things working? So just a bit about myself. My name is Sehrope Sarkuni. I'm the founder at JackDB. I first started using Postgres around 2005, initially just to work on side projects I was working on. I've worked in software development for about 15, 16 years now, primarily in the financial services sector. So I've done employment and consulting at a couple different places. And in general, most of the places I've worked, I've had a lot of involvement in lots of different types of databases. So most of my work involved either data processing, reporting, warehousing, things like that. So naturally that leads to a lot of exposure to lots of different types of databases, and there's a lot of security implications from that as well. I mean, anyone else who's worked in financial services knows that security is it continually comes up on almost like any meeting. And similarly, anyone working in government, healthcare, and payment card industry stuff, but you'll probably see the same types of things. So a lot of the ideas that went into JackDB and going to this talk just is about security. So if anyone wants to talk more about this stuff afterwards, I kind of just like ranting anyway, so bug me afterwards. As far as the overall flow for the talk, the general outline is about database security. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about user-centered security. So I'll get into a bit what that is in a little bit. Then we're going to talk about why audit logging itself is necessary, some other overall problems that and general solutions you can do involving Postgres. How we kind of solve these things together with JackDB, and then I'm going to go into a bit of a demo of how specifically we're using JackDB to solve these things. And then finally, I'm going to show how we can kind of use native tools as well, in addition to JackDB, to kind of get the same solutions. So. When you're thinking about database security, it's kind of split into two parts. So on the one side, you have blocking off access itself to your system. So right before this talk, actually, we were talking about the pgahpa.conf. It's one way of firewalling off your system. Half of that is just blocking people you don't want to access. The other half is allowing access for the people you do want to get in. So the majority of this talk is actually going to be about people who you want to have access to your system. So what is user-centered security? So the idea for user-centered security is that you focus on usability as the primary motivation for how you design your system. If you have a system that's difficult for users to use or doesn't let them get their job done, you end up trying to find ways to work around it. So a classic example of that is if you have access to some kind of database through it's like a reporting tool, let's say, where all the user can run is pre-canned reports. Eventually, they start finding ways to work around the system because you can't even get your job done anymore. Because I can only run these 3 reports, but I really want to do this. I want to do this ad hoc thing, or I want to try something else. So then people start finding other ways of kind of accessing systems, and it ends up being almost accepted at the place they work, because if you didn't do those things, you wouldn't even be able to get your job done. So kind of approaching security from a usability argument, saying find a way for people to get their jobs done in a secure fashion, and then you kind of you get it's a double win basically, because people are happy because they can do their jobs, and you solve the security argument. So if you actually want to read up, there's a nice paper. I'll post the slides after so you can follow up on it, but it's actually a really nice paper on this topic, and then kind of a follow-up on that paper again about 10 years later. So as far as problems in database security, I mean, one of the biggest problems just around passwords themselves. There's lots of problems associated with passwords. Anyone who's worked at any company with more than one person has probably shared a password with somebody. And as soon as you do it, this is a bad idea. It's it's not the right way to do things, but you end up sharing passwords. Oh, here's access to the system. People literally, I get emails oh, here's the username and password to some system, just coming in a plain text email from somebody, or they write it on a sticky note and just stick it onto their desk, and it probably just stays there for the whole time someone's working somewhere. The sharing passwords actually leads to other problems as well, because if you have multiple people using the same password, it makes it much more difficult to rotate the password. If you actually want to change a password, all of a sudden you have to, you have 10 guys using it for the same thing. You change it, then some guy in accounting or whatever calls up and says, "Why isn't this thing running?" And then it turns out it's because one of the guys that you shared the password with started building an automated system that uses your personal credentials or something. And we joke about these things, but at basically any large company I've worked at, I've seen this. And the larger the company, I can see one guy smiling. The larger the company, the more you see things like this. Now, the other alternative is you actually have separate credentials for systems. If I actually go there, I create myself a user ID in system A, user ID in system B with separate passwords for each one, and every user has their own password. from a security argument, yeah, it's great because I have these separate passwords that are not shared. But from a maintenance argument, it becomes a kind of a pain because, again, if I want to rotate my passwords, I have to go individually into these systems and change each one. And if someone it just becomes more of a pain to maintain. And again, right before this call, before this talk, I was talking to someone who just said that they created their own system for rotating passwords across multiple databases because of this specific problem. So now, if you have to pick between these two things, either I have people sharing passwords or I have this maintenance problem. Now, passwords, it's as far as authentication goes with a username and passwords, how you access something. It's just credentials that you give to someone to access something. It's not by itself, it doesn't mean anything. The whole point of it is that you want to be able to access somewhere. So that whole topic, you can just consider it to be user provisioning. If you go starting to work somewhere, when I started to work at one company, I was working in the HR department doing technology work. They got access to a number of HR systems. So individually, they went in, create a user here, create a user there. Here's the shared user ID for this other system. There is no one defined way of doing user provisioning. Most of the places I've worked, it's been pretty ad hoc, where whatever group you're in, they say here's the 10 databases that we connect to, or here's the other database system we connect to, and they'll just give you access. So over time, as you're working somewhere, you kind of accumulate access to all these different systems, and by the time you leave, you have access to every possible place in the company that you've worked at. The other side of that for user deprovisioning is when you're leaving somewhere, whether you're transitioning from one group in the company to another, or if you're actually leaving the company as a whole, you want to get rid of that guy's access. If he's not working in the HR department anymore, he probably should not have access to the HR database. If he's not in finance anymore, he probably shouldn't have access to the general ledger. It kind of ties back to the shared password issue as well, because if you're sharing passwords and you're not rotating them, you're basically asking someone, you're kindly asking them to forget a password. And if you ask someone to forget something, that's not a real security solution for things. And people just ignore it. I mean, that's what happens. Another kind of related thing is, if you have when you're designing an application, you don't want to have just one user ID for the application either. You'll have the main user ID for the application that handles from an application perspective that interacts with the app. But you don't want to use that same user for all the other ad hoc querying that you're doing, or maybe even different job functions within the application. You want to segregate it out into separate user IDs. If you only have one user ID, it's on the one side it's dangerous too. If you log in there, you might accidentally drop something. But it's also within the same system, there's times when you want to segregate out who can see what within the same database. So you don't really see it as much of a problem because people I think are pretty sane about having separate read-only IDs for things. But actually splitting it out to multiple groups of people within different roles of access to the same database, there's more to look at for that as well. So one other thing I like ranting about is it's about SSL. This is actually kind of fun when I talked about it last year. When you're connecting to a database with SSL or just in general using SSL in any kind of application, it's almost always wrong. And when I say wrong, it's if you're connecting to your bank, for example, in the browser, and if you connect to, I don't know, ABC Bank, whatever it's called, if the certificate that's presented to you is not for your bank, your browser gives this big warning on the screen saying, warning, danger, someone could be man in the middle of you, whatever. If you connect with basically any piece of software, 99% of I think non-browser software, they don't do any certificate validation whatsoever. So yes, your connection is encrypted. Yes, there is SSL on the wire, but if there was a man in the middle between you and whatever you're connecting to, you wouldn't notice. Because you're just saying, you're asking, hey, who are you to the remote server, and the server says, yeah, I'm whoever you want me to be, and you say, okay, yeah, that's great, because you're not actually checking it. No one really notices this, and no one really talks about it too much, because if you're on your own network, it's not that much of an issue. But if you're connecting over the open internet, for example, to a cloud database provider or something, it's this is something you really should start considering. In most most drivers for databases and most applications do support some way of doing SSL validation. I mean, if you want to talk about handling in Java, for example, come talk to me afterwards. I can show you how to do it. But this is something that you do need to solve. And if you think about it, when you have multiple people accessing a database, whether it's a cloud system or locally, you kind of have this problem distributed out. Because it ends up being, each person accessing the system has to deal with all these problems. So even if I'm the one connecting to the to the database properly, and I've set up SSL certificate validation. If some other guy connects to the same database and he doesn't go through those steps of actively checking the certificate, things like that, you have like a possibility of him being suspect to man in the middle over there. So also in Postgres specifically, I mean, as far as mandating SSL, there's two levels of this. There's not using SSL at all, and then not using SSL with certificate validation. Postgres is actually pretty good about forcing SSL because you can just tweak it in the pghpa.conf, so that's good. But if you want to validate, you actually have to still go out of your way to do it. So again, as far as access privileges goes, I kind of touched on this before. Most places actually are pretty good about separating out read and write access, but you can kind of go a little deeper with that too, having completely separate roles for things. And again, whenever you're sharing passwords, having just a single read-only role for something, it starts being complicated because you can't rotate the password for it anymore. These things kind of all tie together. So now I'm going to talk a bit about role-based access controls. So if you're familiar with database roles, for example, it's a pretty straightforward concept where you're granting access to some kind of tables, views, whatever it is, functions, to a role, and multiple people could be part of that role. We take that same idea but apply it to users from a human level. So if you look at multiple humans working in a company, for example, people. Each one, you're part of a job function. Again, if my example from before, if you're working in the technology department for human resources, you're in HR tech, for example. Your job function requires access to some number of systems. So we consider that to be a role. If you're in a different finance group, that would be a separate role, and you might be part of multiple roles. It's a pretty straightforward concept, and again, if you're coming from a database background, it translates almost directly to what you see inside the database. But the difference here is that role you're accessing different, what we call data sources. So, and when I say data source, it's a data source. It's not just a database. So, in Postgres' case, for example, when you have a Postgres cluster running, a database can have multiple users that can connect it. You can have multiple schemas inside, and multiple users can connect to the same database, and they'll see different, what they can do within that database depends on the user itself. So in our parlance, when we say data source, it's actually a combination of a database and a user that you're connecting with. So that once I'm in there, what I can do inside that database is kind of based on the combination of those two. Because if I connect with the read-only ID, I can read only the table. I can select from the tables. But if I connect with the write ID, I might be able to modify the tables. And again, with data sources, the idea is that roles are allowing you to, roles grant access to human users to data sources, and the data sources themselves will handle the restrictions of what you can do. So again, in the case of Postgres, for example, you can get very, very fine-grained of what you can grant and what you can allow someone to do, whether it's executing procedures, seeing specific, being able to select from specific tables or views. There's really cool stuff going on with role-level security, which should come into play. It's up to the database, though, to restrict those things. From our perspective of accessing data sources, all we care about is if you have access to data sources, is access to this data source, whatever that means, is part of a role. So the other fun topic when it comes to security is audit logging. So all this stuff before, it's really important to make sure the person's authenticated. It's really important to understand, the way that they're connecting is secure. But once someone actually gets in there, being able to have bookkeeping, keep track of who did what and who that person is really important. If you're working in any kind of regulated industry, this ends up being very, very important. One place where I worked where we actually had a lot of people sharing access to the same system using shared credentials, it ended up being a nightmare from just a reporting perspective, figuring out who had access afterwards. So being able to track this stuff, it's you need to know for regulatory reasons or even just for sanity's sake, really, who has access to these systems. And it's difficult to keep track unless you actually have strong audit logging in place. In Postgres case, for example, by Postgres' logging, you can actually log down to individual SQL statements. You can say who the user is, what IP address they connected from. You can do a lot from at a granular level. But some of the issues with it is that it's done on individual servers, so you still have to consolidate this. If I have 10 different servers running Postgres, I need some way of getting the data from all these servers into one place so I can grep through them together. If I'm connecting to, if I have different types of databases, for example, if I have MySQL, Oracle, or something else deployed there, each one's a little different. There's no one way to handle what this data is supposed to look like. And going back to all those problems we had before for shared user IDs, shared passwords, if you have 10 guys logging in, it says app read, it's kind of hard to figure out which guy is the one that ran the query. So like you'll see a line in the log that says app read ran select star from whatever it is. And maybe you have like an IP address, maybe there's like maybe you don't even have an IP address really if there's like some router or something in between blocking that. So not having that granular level there, like the other problems kind of compound together because even if you get all this audit logging data, it's not really that useful. So a couple other things about like audit logging. Like I said, it's meant to be immutable. You only want to be able to write it and not destroy anything. And again, the identity that's associated with audit logging is really if you're trying to track the actions of users, you want to know who that user is, like who the human behind it is. So like we're not talking about tracking applications, but when you're actually tracking people, I want to know that Sehrope is the one that executed this query. I want to know that Bob is the one that executed this query, regardless of how they actually came into the system. All right, so now I'm going to kind of switch over to the demo. Oh, if anyone has any questions along the way, I mean, I'll have more time afterwards probably for it, but just interrupt me, it's fine. So now I'm going to go into JackDB a bit and show you guys how we kind of solve some of these things. Thanks. So JackDB is it's a database security product. A big part of it that there's a web interface to your databases. So I logged in now as Bob. So you actually can't see the thing on you. I'll take care of that afterwards. So I logged in as Bob. Actually, wait, I have to fix this. All right. So when you log in, the first thing that you see is the data sources that you have access to. So first thing you'll notice, since I logged in as myself, that's the only time I'm going to have to authenticate with this system. And like from now on, like JackDB knows that I am Bob. So whatever Bob has access to is the old we go from authentication now just to authorization to figure out what I can do. So you see here I have these like 3 different databases here. So I'll connect to one of them. So now I connect to this database. Another thing you'll notice, I didn't actually have to specify a password or anything because again, I've already authenticated. There's, to me, to authenticate myself again, I'm just going to say again, I'm Bob. So there's no, there's no real value in just putting in my password again. What we really want to know is, does Bob have access to this database? Yes, he does. So he's allowed to connect in. From the usability argument I was talking about before, of people actually being able to, get their jobs done using something. Traditionally, when you're building a security product, if you go from the angle of just trying to lock down what people can do, you end up with a lot of really unhappy people. So part of our angle of, the approach of working on JackDB is to make something that someone actually wants to use. So although you have all these like security features in there and there's like a big emphasis on security, the other side of it is that you want to make a really good database client. I mean, in this case, the number one user of JackDB is actually me. Whenever there's a feature I want to put inside the app, something I want to use from Postgres, there's a lot of Postgres-specific features, for example, added in here. Now, as far as the interface itself, it should be pretty straightforward for anyone who's used basically any GUI client. On the left, you have like an object browser. On the right, you have a query executor. It supports explain plans. It supports running queries. I don't know if you noticed, but when I first came in, there actually already was text written on the already loaded into the editor. And the results that was already there, because everything's managed on the server side with JackDB actually proxying the connections, the state for whatever you're working on actually gets maintained as well. So in the case of I already logged in, I already had a query, they already had results. You can actually if you're running something, you can leave and come back and everything's still there. So again, from the usability perspective, we want to, you want to make something better for people. And again, as far as Postgres specific stuff go, I mean, as long as I'm in here, I'll just show you guys a couple things. Here the object tree goes. I mean, there's nothing really. We support things like enums, for example, something that we use ourselves for a lot of things. I like having things in my database be really strongly typed, so you can just directly list them out. All the usual stuff like foreign tables, views. You can list out metadata for things. Postgres itself, besides having besides all these great features from it's a really great database with a lot of Postgres-specific features that we like, and one of them, for example, is copy. So traditionally running like a copy from, just getting something to the CSV file is actually kind of a pain, and copy is the best way of getting data out of Postgres. So one of the things I wanted to have was a database client that lets you just run a copy and just, you get the file like immediately afterwards. It's little things like this that actually make your life a lot more pleasant instead of trying to like spool something to a file and coming back again.
That's already better than PG admin. That's already better than PG admin.
So we support there's quite a bit of really specific stuff. Actually, you want to see one more pretty cool one. We use a lot of JSON as well, particularly for audit logging. JSON is just fantastic when it comes to storing any kind of like free-form data, really. So if you like audit data, for example, you have a lot of standard common fields like timestamp, user, IP address, things like that. But generally, you'll have some kind of type-specific information. Like if someone's writing, for an audit trail, for example, when someone's running a query, the query itself is type-specific for the execute action. If someone's logging in, the username, well, the username would actually be its own field, but it's for each event type, basically, you can have using JSON for like that event-specific data is pretty useful. So I kind of have here a really contrived example of using row to JSON to generate JSON. So row to JSON is a really cool function where you can just turn anything in Postgres, like any tuple, a set of tuples, into JSON. So what you can actually do is, since we use a lot of JSON, looking at JSON is kind of a pain. So if you ran this query in PSQL, you end up with this big string just going across. So it's kind of convenient just to be able to double click on things and have it break out and look at data in a more of a sane way. We actually have a couple other things like this too. If someone wants to kind of get into this afterwards, just having more feature demo, just let me know. I like just talking about this stuff. So again, the focus here though is you have this database client that actually is usable for someone to actually get whatever their job is done. You have access to native features, native native tooling kind of things. But as far as the security side for this goes, again, I'm just logging in as myself. I'm able to access this database because I've been authorized to access this database. So now let's see the other side of it, because right now we're just going in as Bob as a user. Let's go to the other side of how this stuff, how Bob has access really. So now I'm going to log in as Sehrope. So now if you log in as Sehrope, I have access to more databases, all the ones that Bob had access to and a couple other ones. So I don't know if you noticed, but Bob had just the 2 demo databases and the read-only world database. So if I go over to account overview here, so then we go to users. So let me click on Bob. So if we look at Bob here, Bob is assigned to the role PG Open Demo. And as being part of this role, he has access to these 3 data sources. So the way this works is that rather than having to individually grant access to things, I can just add someone to this PG Open Demo role, and they'll have access to these 3 data sources. Later on, if Bob is no longer part of the PG Open Demo, then we just take him out of the role, and he doesn't have access anymore. So they kind of demo. So it really is just removing someone from a role. You don't have to ask them to forget a password. You don't have to revoke something, and you don't even have to muck with the individual databases themselves. In this case, I have 3 data sources attached to this role. Just by clicking one remove, Bob no longer has access to any of those data sources. So now Bob is basically useless. So let's actually put him back in for a second too. Now, as far as the data sources themselves, before I was kind of harping on properly validating SSL certificates, for example. When you have something like JackDB in the middle, handling the connections, you only have to have the connection happen once, be connected properly once. So if you look, right now I'm connected with HTTPS from my browser to JackDB. So that's an SSL connection from the user itself to JackDB. JackDB's connection to the the database that we're connecting to, in this case, we actually support explicitly verifying the SSL certificates as well. So since you're not relying on users themselves to individually do it correctly, basically you do it once, and everyone connecting in through this now kind of gets the benefit of connecting the same way. So you can actually just specify the certificate for whatever you're connecting to. So all this is it's nice. We can add users, we can remove users, add them to roles. But what's really cool about this too is that everything that's being executed, everything that's being done is tracked as well. So if I go over here, you can look at the individual queries that were run. So like, if you see here Bob, he ran like select to JSON or whatever. Every single time that someone runs a query, it's automatically tracked, but it's transparent to the user themselves. You don't have to actually, aggregate data together. You don't have to bring in log files from multiple places. And this actually works for any type of database. In this case, for this whole demo, I'm going to be working with Postgres, but we support a couple other database types as well. Postgres is just a little bit special, which I'll show you guys in a second why. And the audit trail itself is actually full, there's full text search. If you want to go through and, search for one particular query, whatever it is, you can go by user, by IP address. And again, in this case, the user that's connecting in, since Bob has authenticated himself as a human coming in, I know this is Bob connecting to this database. Even though, in this case, we have multiple people sharing, you have shared credentials to the same database, because that one data source has a single username and password. But I still know the individual user that's executing the query on each one of these databases. So if like Alice goes in or Setup goes in and runs, connects that database, it'll still show the world read user ID when I connect to that database. But I know that I can differentiate between those individual users. So let me actually hop back to the thing for a second again. So all this stuff is nice, query interface, it's fun, it's clean. I actually love using it. I spend basically half my day doing research for JackDB using JackDB. But sometimes you want a little more than it. There's not everything that you want to do you can necessarily do from a web interface. So although for looking at data, for example, playing with JSON, things like that, or just going through the object browser, I definitely say it's better than going on the command line. I'm biased, but I'd say it's better. But there's times when you want to use other things as well. I'm sure there's at least one person in this room who I'm looking at right now who loves PSQL and won't use anything else. And it'd be really nice to be able to use those same things but still get this transparent auditing, this this single authentication or things like that. So the other part that we did for JackDB actually lets us do that. So I'm going to show you guys something else that's cool now. So what you can actually do here. So for this demo, actually, this is an enterprise version of JackDB, which also includes, besides the web app, also includes what we call our database proxy. So it actually supports connecting to it using any libpq compatible application. So in this case, I'm going to be connecting with PSQL, but you could also run like pgdump, pgadmin, basically anything that speaks libpq. So in this case, when I connect in, by default, my username is set up on my desktop, so it automatically assumes my username is set up. I'm just going to connect in here. So now I'm connected to that same database. Now you'll notice the host name I connected to is actually the same as the web server for JackDB, pgopen.demo.jacktb.com. But I'm just connecting to it as if I'm connecting through PSQL. And to specify the database that I'm connecting to, like this world database over here, this is what we call an alias. So if you look at the definition for this database over here, we have this separate field alias. You could almost imagine this as like a global namespace for for the databases that you're connecting to. So now when I'm connecting in, all I need to remember to specify is this one word world, like to represent the name of the database, and I'm able to connect in. So I'm in. This is everything that you'd expect inside of from PSQL, run queries, do whatever you want really. But the authentication itself is being handled through whatever the authentication provider we're using for JackDB is. So in this case, again, I have like a local password store for JackDB. But if I want to integrate this with like LDAP, for example, you could have like LDAP authentication for the users to authenticate themselves, and you get that same authentication for all your databases. Similarly, if I set up like two-factor authentication for my user, the authentication step would use two-factor authentication, and then I get to connect to my database again afterwards. So you're kind of separating out the authentication from the authorization. But you still get all the, you get the tracking, you get the control. So then if I go over here to the activity log, I can actually see from the proxy setup came in, he logged in, he ran these queries. All this is just done transparently. From the user's perspective, someone like doing their job, whether you're a DBA managing something or if you're a developer doing a production fix or something, you have like the full native interface for whatever you're doing, and you just happen to have these like, nice externalities of this alternate interface you could use. You don't have to remember host names and ports anymore. You're basically just simplifying the guy's life. So I'll show you one more quick thing of this as well. So if I want to log in as Bob from PSQL, you can just hit -U and you can specify the username. So Bob should be able to log into this database. Let me see. So Bob can get into World, but he can't get into this other database. So I have this other one, Medicare, let's say. So he's not authorized. So let's grant Bob access to this database in one other way. So before I was explaining that we have role-based access controls where you define roles for people to, you define roles and you add users to those roles and you add data sources to those roles, and the intersection of those two is who has access to what. If I'm part of HR, I can access the HR databases. The other form of access that we have is what we call permissions. Now, permissions, there's times when you're accessing a data source where you want access to, on a daily basis, you'll have access to a, read-only version of the data source. But if there's like some production issue or something, you have to go in and fix something, or if you're doing like a migration, for example, you want like limited access to, the read-write, the write ID, for example. But you don't want to have that on a daily basis, and the process for granting or revoking access for things. If people have the password, and then you have to rotate it and change it. It's kind of, just like user provisioning doesn't have any standard way of dealing with itself, there's no real way of granting or revoking access like that. So the other authorization method we come up here is what we call temporal permissions. So I can say, I have Bob here, I want to give him access to the Medicare database, and I can say he has access for like 1 hour. So now this creates like a separate authorization entry that he can use to connect in, and it'll automatically expire afterwards. So if I have like a production deployment, let's say this Friday or something, on Friday the admin could grant access to like the dev team to do the deployment, and then you don't have to go revoke it afterwards. Just automatically happens. If they need to extend access, you can just grant the more of a permission. So now if I go back over here, log in as Bob. So now Bob can log in, has access to. And boom, he has access. And again, if you, one other cool thing about this is that since the access itself, it automatically takes care of closing the connection if the access itself doesn't exist anymore. So to kind of simulate Bob doing, like continually working, I'm just going to run PG sleep here. So let's say Bob is in the middle of doing something, but now Bob is no longer part of the company. You want to revoke his access. You actually want to be able to cut it off. So if I revoke this access over here, immediately it actually kicks it out because it'll close the connection. Because again, by having the proxy in between, whether it's through the web interface or through the proxy interface, you have the ability to actually, not only introspect what's going on in the connection, but to actually control and turn them off immediately. You don't have to, have these like tails kind of hanging out all over the place. All right, so jumping back. So again, you could use anything with it basically. In this example, I use PSQL, but I've run PG dump through it. I really like the database aliases myself because then I don't have to remember any servers anymore. It's basically just the one server, and after that it's just app-dev, app-QA, app-write, or whatever. It's really pleasant. So that was a continued demo. So, all right, so kind of like going back over this again, what are the things that we solve by going through, by using these things? Since we have a single authentication store now for users, whether it's whether it's internal or whether it's LDAP, you can have this one long password. I think before someone was saying, hey, that was a long password you typed in. Yeah, it is long. Your password should be long, but you just shouldn't have that many passwords. If you have less passwords, then you only have to remember one really long password, which is good. Since the database credentials themselves for the data sources that we're accessing are on the server side, it's really easy to rotate them. In this case, if I want to change like the password for the Medicare database, for example, I just go in there and change it in one place, and everyone accessing that data source will now use the new password. I don't have to tell people. I don't have to write some kind of custom script to update it in 10 places. And if users change their own passwords, it's also immediately reflected because they're either using the one authentication store within the application itself, or they're using the whatever your LDAP is or Active Directory or whatever it is. From an interface perspective, as a user, you have this like pleasantness of this nice interface. It does all this great stuff for Postgres and all this other stuff. But you also get to use all your native tools as well. You're not asking the guy to jump through hoops just so you can track what's going on. And you get the externalities of I don't have to remember servers anymore. I just have to what do I want to connect to? Just put that as like the name of the alias and you're done. from the security side, you have the user. I'm assuming is pretty happy since you're not mucking with his workflow at all, and you're just giving him more things to work with. On the security side, again, you have a single. You solve password rotation. You can actually add two-factor authentication. So from the web app, you can actually configure it so that your user has two-factor auth, and it actually works with PSQL as well. So on the command line, when you connect in, you get prompt for the. You have to include the two-factor. So you can actually have two-factor authentication for all your databases with this as well. So user provisioning, we have a sane way of doing it where if someone joins the company, I just add him to whatever groups or roles that he's part of. Deprovisioning actually finally is really sane in that if someone leaves the company, I literally just revoke access to his roles or just lock his user ID. There's no more like forgetting passwords, like asking people to forget passwords. There's no more just siloed database like access or usernames, things like that. It's just done in one place really. And finally, from the auditing perspective, you actually have an audit trail for everything that's happening, and it's just generated transparently. Because again, if you have to jump through hoops to get this information or to consolidate it or be able to search it, you're not going to, it just doesn't work as well because you won't be able to accumulate the information, and you're going to start inconveniencing people, and then people are not going to want to use the tooling or whatever it is that generates it. And this is I think, one of the main reasons people don't like using like pre-canned report generators and things like that. Because you get kind of boxed into this like one thing, and then you want to tweak one little thing, and it doesn't work. So kind of putting this all together and having it done transparently is this is why we call it user-centered security, because the focus is on you want to have usability. It's like usability first with all the security coming along with it. So just like one more point on all this. You'll notice that in the app itself, like we don't actually do any filtering whatsoever for the SQL that people are executing. When it comes to connecting to your database, it's your database's job really to control what you have access to. You should have grants, roles, whatever it is inside the database, restrict access, read-only IDs, whatever that is. A big part of that is because I believe in people actually learning to write SQL. If you look, before I keep talking about like pre-canned report generators not being enough, and if you look at just the business world, it's like 15 years ago, you had a very small group of people with access to databases. It was basically just like the handful of developers dealing with the system, and maybe like the DBAs managing it. Over time, though, now you start seeing like marketing people having access, business analysts having access. SQL is like the language of data, really, and like more and more as people are accessing it, all these security. I don't want to call them security problems, but like security issues need to be solved even more because now you have even more people accessing things. So rather than like trying to force them into a hole through like some pre-canned reports or like some pseudo language or whatever it is, I think people should just have the full access to SQL itself, but in like a pleasant way where you can you get all the security benefits as well. So yeah, so that's basically my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer some.
Does this have a plugin system or some kind of way of accommodating like query filtering? Like you can set it up so that it will reject any query without a word clause, for instance, since you're auditing since you have a proxy set up?
At the moment, no. We don't do any filtering whatsoever. It's not that we couldn't. It's that we just don't because it's I mean, like I said, I believe in people just being able to write whatever the heck they want to write. I guess in your case, you're more concerned about you don't want people writing something that blows up your system.
Well, it seems opportune since you have a system like this to be able to inject that kind of control. Because if someone writes a strategic product or something, you'll be able to reject that. And for me, it'd be great to have like a module say if the cost is say above like $1 million, just refuse to run it entirely or something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting to think about actually, because I mean, if you have the spot for the introspection, I mean. Oh, let's talk afterwards. Let's see. Anybody else have a question?
So, in your Jack TV, the client, when you do explain, do you see actually the graphic representation? I don't know how you.
Oh, it's actually it's the same text representation that you'd see inside of if you ran it from like PSQL, for example.
You could integrate the deep SD stuff.
Actually, I've been thinking about having a link over there. It's a thought of just having automatically import in, or even just like parsing.
Yeah, like give it kind of similar display.
Yeah.
Structure.
We actually had something similar to that before, and I kind of want to tweak it a bit. So we'll probably be adding it back again sometime soon. Because even like the explain plan itself, right now we're getting the text representation back, but there's actually like JSON and YAML representations, which are much easier to parse anyway. And since we're the ones running the explain, I can kind of control exactly how it works.
Oh yeah, I forgot they added that thing.
Yeah, it's actually really convenient. Anybody else? Going once, twice? All right. Well, thank you very much, guys.